Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me in this presentation about building a platform as a service with Waypoint. In this presentation, we'll explore a tool we built around Waypoint called WayPaaS. As you understand, we're not here about naming creativity. So a bit about me. I've been a HashiCorp tool user for many years. I think it was something like 10 years since I first used Vagrant, and then maybe 6 or 7 years Terraform. So I'm usually one of the first people to jump on the Terraform tooling. In Citrix, I lead the team that does cloud platform engineering and sovereign cloud engineering. So in terms of tooling, our goal is to build tools and infrastructure that are going to enable teams to move faster and safer in the cloud. So essentially, it's about developer productivity, developer experience, faster time to market for new features, and easier to adopt security standards. And this is a motivation behind Waypoint. So improving developer experience and improving developer productivity are two of the goals for this. So we're going to start by seeing what HashiCorp Waypoint is, how it works, where it would fit into your life cycle. We'll see what it's still kind of missing, and that's just an opinion. And we're going to see what WayPaaS is and why it was necessary to build around Waypoint in order to enable this platform as a service experience. So I said we're going to start by seeing what Waypoint is, but a little bit of a spoiler since WayPaaS is the main reason we are here. Let's just define it, and then we can go a bit deeper. So WayPaaS is a platform built on top of Waypoint to provide a PaaS workflow aimed to improve developer experience and productivity. So if you've seen the Waypoint website, you might think, OK, but isn't that what Waypoint does? Isn't Waypoint essentially there to replace Heroku or provide this PaaS experience? And it kind of is, but it also kind of isn't if you're talking about more complex use cases and more complex scenarios. And this is what we're going to be focusing on today. So in order to see why it isn't, let's try to define Waypoint first. Let's see how it works. One of the biggest questions the community has at the moment is where exactly does Waypoint fit? So I also want to go fast over that, and then we can talk about WayPaaS. So a bit of a story, and is Buki here? Sorry for the story. So a bit of a story. I remember when I first went into the Terraform website, and if you see Terraform, it says automate infrastructure on any cloud. I think that's, we kind of know exactly what it does, right? Now, when I first went into the Waypoint website, what it says is Waypoint allows developers to deploy, manage, and observe their applications through a consistent abstraction of underlying infrastructure. That's a bit more words, right? So, and it makes sense because Waypoint is a lot more complicated. The use case is a lot more complicated, but it focuses more on what you get. And you start thinking about it. And OK, but Waypoint, is that the PaaS? Am I going to replace Heroku with it? Or is it something like Helm for all infrastructure? And then you might start panicking because you think that it might replace Jenkins, which you love, and you've written all those scripts for it. But it's I would say, none of the above. And a bit of a spoiler, it sits along with your CI/CD, so you're going to be able to keep all this nice Jenkins stuff you've built. So my definition of Waypoint is Waypoint enables operators to build PaaS experiences for development teams with full access to underlying abstracted infrastructure. So essentially, that means that operations teams are able to have full access in the infrastructure, but this infrastructure is abstracted for the development teams. So essentially, it's a PaaS for simple enough use cases, but if your use case is complicated enough, then it's a tool to enable you to build a PaaS on top of it. That's how, at least, we understood the tool. So the use case, the business case for Waypoint, the why behind it is, first of all, hide some of the infrastructure complexity for the development team, improve developer experience, reduce time to market for new features, and finally, streamline the application lifecycle management. So when I was putting together this presentation, I wanted to create a slide where we can talk about 30 seconds how Waypoint works. Sorry for this. This is the best I could come up with. So a project is a repository, and then you have the pipeline, which essentially the life cycle of a pipeline has 3 stages: build, deploy, and release. And on the right, you see roughly how a Waypoint HCL file would look like. So you have the build stage. That could be build packs. We might know build packs from Heroku, a great tool. You might have Docker, where you build based on a Docker file. You have the deploy stage, where it can be ECS, it can be Kubernetes, it can be a lot of different things. And then you have the release stage, this is probably my favorite part of Waypoint, is that it's one of the first tools that is really opinionated about the release being different than deployment stage. So you can have the CI, you can have the CD, and then you can have the release on demand with Waypoint, which is really nice. So you kind of see this one-to-one relationship between the project and the repository. You push your code, and then you just run one command and do nothing with the infrastructure, and this is deployed automatically. So this kind of feels like a PaaS, right? Well, as I said before, if the use case is simple enough, yes, that's the intention, and it can be a PaaS where you just run Waypoint up and everything happens magically, and you essentially have a Heroku. But remember, the initial goal was to abstract the underlying infrastructure. That means enable people who are not aware of Kubernetes, enable them to deploy on Kubernetes without them having to read or to understand how to write Helm charts, or even HCL for that matter. So let's just use an example. So going back to the deploy stage, and starting from the image in the far right, if your application is simple enough, if you just have a Flask server or a Node.js server, you're going to just say deploy, use Kubernetes, and magically everything is going to be up in Kubernetes. But that's not going to work in the real world. You're going to need some replication. So, OK, easily enough, you're going to add the number about replicas, and you're going to be done. But wouldn't you need some auto-scaling? So you add a bit more. And then you want to add some health probes, and you want to change the container port. And as you see, you slowly end up writing essentially a health chart just in HCL. So the development team is going to essentially have 2 reasons to not like you. So this is kind of one of the most important things that was missing from us. And I'm going to start by something that Mitchell tweeted when Waypoint was first released. So if you focus on what he's writing, is essentially you want something to replace Heroku without being such opinionated as Heroku. So that's a good thing on the one side, but what that does is when you have more complex needs about Kubernetes deployment, you end up writing a whole Helm chart, or you expect developers to understand and write HCL. And in the time where we kind of shift everything left, so we shift observability left, we shift security left, we shift infrastructure left, then we're actually not helping developer productivity that much. So that's the one issue. So we wanted to find a way to use Waypoint without having to write all the HCL. The second point is, as I said, it has a really good pipeline structure. So you have build, deploy, release. But we never talked about testing. So if we are talking about lifecycle management, CI automatically is out of this. The third thing is that although authentication exists, anything that we do in the Waypoint server is authenticated. It's just authenticated. So we don't have role-based access control. We don't have authorization and those kind of things. And of course, there is some functionality. This is use case specific that we wanted to restrict, so we don't want someone to be able to run Waypoint exec and execute commands in a production environment. So that's also something we wanted to be able to cut. So if we go back to the business case, yes, it definitely improves developer productivity. 100% reduces time to market. It does abstract infrastructure components. Potentially in our use case and in a complex use case, we need a bit more abstraction. And of course, it's really easy to manage the life cycle, but the life cycle needs some more steps in it. Finally, we are here to see what you came for. WayPaaS is the result is what we built in order to solve these problems. So the initial thoughts we had on Waypoint was to add an extra layer to make it a bit more opinionated. Make it a bit opinionated and tie this with enterprise identity, use enterprise identity, group memberships, and configure user profiles in that sense, and then have defaults, have templates per team. That way, development teams don't have to do essentially anything. They don't have to write a configuration file anymore. They don't have to learn HCL. And for them, it's essentially the same if they deploy in ECS or if they deploy in Kubernetes. It's just a different flag in the command line. And of course, as I said before, narrowing the scope of the abilities the development team has in production. So let's see how this works. We start with the WayPaaS init command. So that's kind of the setup command. So what happens here is you authenticate with your enterprise identity, AAD in my case, and you get team membership, you get group membership, and based on that, you configure the user profile. So each team has specific ECS, ECR regions for dev, stage, and production, different kube configs, again, for different environments, replication standards, health probe standards, auto-scaling, and so on. Now, the second part, and we're still setting up the project, is WayPaaS create. And essentially, that's where a new project is created. So what happens is based on the profile we had before, we pre-configure and we auto-generate based on a template the Waypoint HCL file. And the user has a few parameters, a few command line arguments in order to, if you want to override the default, your team might have defaults and templates for both ECS and Kubernetes, so you use the infra flag to say if you're deploying an ECS or Kubernetes. Resources, you might be able to override default resource allocation if your team standards is 1 gig and you need 2, you can override it that way. And ports if you want to change the default container port. But again, those are optional. So your team has predefined those, and you're just using the flags if you want to override those. So what happens in the background is when you run the create command, let's take the example that you write it without any parameters. What happens is you first read locally. You get the local git config in order to find the remote. So you tie the Waypoint project with the Git repository you're working on. You read the team's configuration, and then you create the Waypoint HCL based on that configuration. And going back to the Kubernetes example, the only thing that you've done is WayPaaS init, added your credentials, WayPaaS create, and this is what you have. So essentially, if we can look into some, so for example, in the registry part, you're using ECR as your registry. Region is something that your team is using US East 1. Same, all your team has agreed that our /health is going to be our health check endpoint. So all these are kind of pre-agreed and pre-configured. And of course, you can override them, but just running 2 commands, you can end up with this. And well, what we talked about up to now essentially is not lifecycle management, is just setting up the process. So what happens in the rest of the lifecycle? And essentially, this is pure Waypoint almost. So we have 3 stages, which is build, deploy, release. And it's based on a really, really simple Git flow. So we have master, dev, and feature branch. When you work on the feature branch, you push that, then CI is triggered, then you run just the build command. So you run Waypoint build, and your artifact is built. What's going to happen after when you're done with working on the feature? You're going to open a PR. This is going to be reviewed. You're going to merge the PR. When this is merged in dev, that's the point where we're going to run Waypoint deploy in the dev environment. Still, we're not going to be releasing yet. So the difference between deploy and release is that release also gives you a public IP, routes traffic. So we are able to deploy something. We have internal access to it. We have private access, but we are not opening it up to the public. So when we merge to dev, we deploy in dev, private access. And then when we want to move this to when we merge this to master, we again deploy, same Waypoint file, different kube config. So we deploy in the staging cluster, but the same artifact. And there is some plumbing under the hood, because if you're using ECR and you have some images, you have to move images between the regions or the sub-accounts, but that's not important. So finally, when you reach to a point that you've tested it in staging, you want to go to production, you just run a WayPaaS promote command. And what that does is, again, same Waypoint configuration, different kube config, deploys in production, but that also runs the release command that gives it the public IP. We have the Waypoint URL service that gives the public IP and opens it up to public traffic. This is what we've built up to now, and this is really young. So we have a big way ahead of us. So this is still in the POC stage. We have a long way to go. We need a more complicated, a more complex, sophisticated Git flow. We need support for more use case, and we need some extensibility in it. As we said before, all the cases we see here are about a simple web server or simple services, but in the real world, you're probably going to deploy 5 or 10 different microservices, a queue, a database, and a few other good things. So we need to have the ability to deploy a whole stack. One of the things we want is to further explore plugins. So some of the functionality that we've written might be better to go into a plugin. As most HashiCorp tools, Waypoint supports plugin, and it's pretty powerful. Waypoint 0.9 is about to be released, so there are going to be a lot of nice stuff there and probably take away some pain from us. And finally, Waypoint Cloud. Earlier today, there was an announcement about Waypoint Cloud. That's also something to look forward to. So today we learned about what Waypoint is. Where exactly does it fit in your life cycle? What we think is missing from Waypoint, and how WayPaaS, how our platform as a service tool comes to solve that and help improve developer experience. Thank you. So we have some time, so we can take a couple of questions. Anyone?
Yeah, in a matter of simple question, what really stand out from WayPaaS to what Waypoint is actually serving? So what it lacks, Waypoint, that you did achieve?
So if I had to say one thing, it's basing templates and team standards based on enterprise identity. So this is, if Waypoint had this, if this comes out, probably WayPaaS is something we can throw away.